Okay, so let's put a little comment to start as usual. So this is our final project pitch template. Just put the date. And so what we're gonna do is, in the previous lesson, we looked at how to add a button. But the button, basically what we added is just the visuals. It just shows us if we're actually interacting with the rectangle or the circle. But we can't actually change anything based on whether or not we're doing an interaction. So we're gonna add a little bit more logic, and we're gonna use a couple different buttons to essentially move the slides back and forth. So it's very simple. It's just like one really basic application, but it'll be a way to demonstrate how we can get some information out of the buttons. So I'm gonna set up a couple of global variables. We're gonna create a slideshow, and just like we did with our interactive comic, we're gonna use a state to keep track of what slide we're on, and we're gonna use our buttons to change the state. So we'll have a couple different functions that handle that logic, and then we'll have our buttons to react to different events. So I'm gonna create a variable. I'm gonna call this our current slide. So this is whatever slide we're currently viewing, and I'll set that to 1. And then I also need to know how many slides there are in total. So depending on how many slides you have in your presentation, that'll change the logic that you use to go from one slide to the next. So I'm gonna make another variable called total slides. And for the example, I'll just do 4 slides. And again, I'm just using these variable names just to make it clear what they're being used for, but you could call them different things. So then I'm gonna have a next button and a previous button, and because the button is contained within a function, we need to use the logic in the function to evaluate whether we're in the button area, but we need to combine that with a button with a mouse press to actually react to a specific event. So we're gonna create a couple extra variables to track whether we're inside of the button, so we can connect the button logic with our event, our JavaScript event. So I'm gonna create a variable called next slide button, and let's actually take button out and just say next slide active, and we'll set this to false to begin, and we'll have another variable previous. I'm just gonna abbreviate this prev, so prev slide active, and this is false. And if we're hovering over one of those buttons, we'll set that value to true so that we'll know in our greater program logic which button we're currently activating. Okay, so let's set up a couple slides, and then we'll set up our buttons and our logic. So I'm gonna go into the draw section, and I'm gonna make a comment and say first slide so we know what's happening here. And I'll say if current slide equals 1. So if our current slide equals 1, we're just gonna draw what's on our first slide. So we're basically making a very simplistic version of PowerPoint from scratch. So on our first side, we just want the title of our project. You could put your name, whatever you want to go on your first slide normally. So I'll put some text, and it'll say my final project. Hopefully you guys can come up with more creative titles than me. And we'll put this in the middle of our canvas. Let's make our canvas a little bit, well, we can leave it. I guess 400 by 400 is fine. So let's put this in the middle of the canvas. I'm gonna say width over 2, width over 2. And then I'll put another text by Owen. And I'll put this also in the middle, but I'll put it a little bit lower. So I'll say, oh, this should be height, even though my width and height are the same. I'll say height over 2 plus 50. Okay, so here's my first slide. It's not very appealing, so let's make a couple adjustments. Let's change the text align to center. Okay, that looks a little better. Let's change the text size to maybe like 40. Okay, that's starting to look a bit nicer. And let's set the text font to Comic Sans. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's change the fill. Maybe we'll change it to purple. Okay, it's starting to look a little bit nicer. So here's our first slide, and we can start to introduce our project. You can, of course, make your slideshow bigger. You can change whatever aspect you want for the design. I'm just going to kind of set up a couple basic slides. So that's our first slide. Let's add another slide, and then we'll add some logic to go between them. So if current slide equals 2, so if I'm on my second slide, I might change the design a little bit, but I want to basically talk about the premise of my project. So for the premise of my project, let's say I want to combine a couple of assignments that we've done. Maybe I want to combine the sound project that we just did with the pattern project. Just combine the last two projects. And so maybe I'll make a pattern, and when you click on different parts, it plays different sounds. That's more complicated than I probably want to do, but I think be fine. So let's do that. So I'll put some text. I'll say my final project. And here you might want to put text in different places because it's going to take up a lot of space here. Like I could make a variable up here, but I'll just type it out here. So my final project combines the generative pattern project and the sound sampler. So that'll be the first part. And so while I'm developing my slides, right now I don't have any way of moving between the two slides. So we'll add that in a second, but if you want to be able to edit your slides before you've completed everything, we can just change the initial value of the current slide to 2. And now we'll see our second slide. Although I didn't give the text a position, so let's do that. So let's put it at, I'll make this one a little bit different. So I'll put it at like 50x and 50y. It'll just be like a little paragraph. So for this one, I'll do text size is maybe 20. And text font, I'll just copy Comic Sans. And text align is left. Okay. So then my text goes off the screen. So if I have a longer line, remember I can use the width of the text box to set that a little bit to create a defined width. So at this point, my code is getting a little confusing. So let's put our actual values here. So I'll say variable description. And then I'm just going to copy this string here. And let's actually put this in our global scope because we only have to define this once. So I'm going to paste this up here. You don't have to do it this way, but this is a little bit more nicely organized. I can, change the description of my project up here. And now instead of writing this whole thing out, I'll just put description here. And I may need to add more description, but let's just do this for now. And then I'll set the width to like 300 pixels. That should be fine. Okay. And so now I can edit my description here, and it'll update over there. So that makes the code look a little bit nicer down here. You can do the same thing with these pieces of text if you want to make variables for like the title or byline. That may make your code easier to read. So my final project combines the generative pattern project in the sound sampler, and then, you know, whatever you want to include after that. I'll say the user can click on each part of the pattern to play a different sound. Okay, so there's a description. I'll put a little comment here that says this is on slide 2, just so I know where that's going to go. Okay, so now I have 2 slides. I'll finish my slides and then I'll add my logic. So for slide 3, we want to talk about the user interaction. So I'll make a variable called interaction and say, that's basically what I already said right here. So I'll just take this bit and paste it in here. And, you know, obviously if your interaction is different, you can elaborate on that. The interaction doesn't have to be super complicated, but whatever you think will be a fun interaction for the user. And that's where you would include, like, if you're going to use buttons, like the DOM buttons, or if you're going to do other types of interactions, you would do that down here. Maybe I would say, like, there will be a button to save an image of the canvas. So the user can, you know, save an image if they want. So that'll be our 3rd slide. So for my 3rd slide, I'm going to be pretty much doing the same thing as the 2nd slide. So I can just copy and paste this. I could turn this into a function, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just make this slide 3. And then instead of description, I'm going to put interaction. Okay, so now if I change the current slide to 3, we see that interaction there. So that's pretty straightforward. And then for the 4th slide, I'll show the graphics. So slide 4, I'm just going to show some graphics, so I actually don't need any text here. So for slide 4, I'll just do kind of like a version of what it's going to look like. You could also just take a screenshot of a previous project and throw an image on here, or if you're going to use images, you could put that here. So I'm going to say if current slide equals 4, we'll show the graphics. So I'll put a note here that says graphics example, and I'll just do a quick pattern. I'm just going to open up one of my old pattern examples. Okay, let's do a different one. Let's see pattern example 1. It's not the one I want either. Let's see pattern example 2. It's kind of the same thing. Okay, let's see, maybe the last one is what I want. Oh, it's really green. Okay, I'm just gonna use this one for now. It's kind of hard to see because my text is so large. But let's just take this whole function, copy that, and I'll paste it over here, and we'll just call that. And we may have to make some other adjustments, but let's just see how it goes. Oh yeah, so it's gonna, because I'm using the randomness, it's gonna go crazy. So let's just adjust this a little bit. I'm just gonna get rid of the random. Or you know what, I could actually just, yeah, let's just get rid of this. I'll just do fill is green. Oh, but I have all these random, You know, it would probably be easier just to take an image of the first project. So let's do that. Okay, so let's get rid of this. You okay?
No, it changed so quickly that I was like, what's going on?
Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's just grab a picture of this. So I'll say function mouse pressed, save pattern.jpg. Okay. So now I'll have an example in my downloads of what I want my graphics to look like. I'll upload that to my sketch files. And so I'm gonna have to load this. So remember, we have to preload any images. So I'll make a preload function, and I'll say variable graphics example, and I'll say graphics example equals load image, and I'll just use the image name since it's right there on the main folder. And now I'll just draw this image. That'll be way easier than modifying my pattern example. I'll just draw that at 0, 0. There we go. Okay. So you could draw some P5 stuff here. You could, or if you want to do what I just did and just get an image of what you want to do, you could do that. And I'll just put some text here that says graphics, so we know what is going on here. And I'll put that in the middle of the page. Okay, let's do text align center, and text size is 40. Okay, there's our graphics and our text. I'll just set the font in setup actually, so I don't have to set it every time. Let's just move this up here. There we go. Okay, so now I don't have to set the text font every time. This is obviously just if I'm only using one font, I can just set it once in setup, and then it'll stay the same whenever I use it. Okay, so I've got my slideshow set up, and now I would need to add my buttons and my functionality. So what we're gonna look at is we're gonna use a very similar logic for the buttons, but now we need to actually get out of the button whether we're clicking on it or not. And then we need to use that logic to do something in the program. So we'll start by creating a button function, and we'll have a couple different buttons, and we'll be able to just like click on them to either go forward or go backward in our project. So let's set the slide back to 1. And then I'm going to draw some buttons at the very bottom of the project. So I'm going to make a button. I'll start with 1, and I'll draw it at, I guess the bottom right corner is probably a good place to draw it. So I'll draw it at like maybe 350x and 350y. And I won't make it too big. I'll just make it like maybe, let's try 60 by 20. We'll see if that's big enough, but we can make adjustments if we need to. So now let's actually create our button down here. And so we're going to take the X, the Y, the width, and the height. So basically, we just need to draw the button, and then we need to tell the rest of the program if the button is currently active. So I'll put a note here. So this function draws a button and returns whether it is active. Okay. So let's draw a rectangle. So our rectangle is going to be X, Y, width, and height. Okay, so there it is down there. And let's move it over just a little bit. So let's put it at 300x. Okay, that's pretty good. We can always move that around later. It's purple because of our text is purple. So let's just change the fill to white for now. We can adjust this later. And then we're going to want to put some text there or some indication that this is like the next button. So this is another thing where it's going to be different for each button. So we need to put this as one of our arguments. Anything that's different has to be part of our arguments. So I'm going to put next here. And then this will be our text, we can't use text because that's already a function. So let's just call this, well, I could call it txt. That'll be close enough. So then we'll put some text here, txt at xy. Okay, it's a little too big, so we'll have to style it. So we'll say text size, and let's use height. Okay, and for the fill, let's make it black. And then we actually have to move it over a little bit, but let's try the text align first. So text align, let's try left and center. That's pretty good, but it looks like we need to use either top or bottom. Okay, that looks pretty good. It's a little squished in there, so maybe we'll like add a couple pixels to make the text look a little bit better. I don't know why it keeps moving this part, but that's okay. Do I have a different X and Y somewhere? No. Oh, because this text align doesn't specify. So say center. Okay. Okay. So that's looking pretty good. We have a button. Now let's detect if we're activating the button. So remember, we need to check all of our different parameters. So we start with X. Are we greater than X but less than X plus width? So we're inside the horizontal part of the button. And then we do the same thing on the Y. And then we also need to tell our program if we're active. So I'm going to create a variable that exists just inside the button called isActive. And we're going to start this out as false. And if we detect that we're inside of the button, we'll change this to true. So we'll say if our X value, our mouse X is greater than our X value, and our mouse X is less than our X value plus our width. So we're checking to see if our mouse is beyond the left side of the button, but not farther than the left side of the button plus the width of the button. So then we check the same thing on the Y axis. So is mouse Y greater than the Y value of the button? And mouse Y is less than Y plus H. Okay, so we have 4 different conditions, so we check each side of the button, and we use our double ampersand in between each of the conditions to say we have to evaluate each single one of these conditions has to be true. Okay, so if all of those are true, then our button is active. So we set isActive to true. So we'll be able to send that back to our main program to say that we are inside the button. And then we're also going to change the fill so that we'll know that we're in the button. So let's change the fill to yellow. And then we'll put this white fill inside the else statement for our default. Okay, so now we can see it's yellow when we hover over here. And so now, how do we get this isActive out of our function? And so this is a new thing that I don't think we've talked about before, but functions can do something called returning a value. So they can return information to our main program. And this is how we can communicate between a function, like part of our program, and another part of our program. So what we're going to do is we're going to return at the very bottom. You have to do this at the end because it's going to end the function. When you do a return, the whole function is going to stop. So we're going to return isActive. And what that's going to do is it means that we can get isActive out of the button and we can assign it to this variable that we created a long time ago called nextSlideActive. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to paste this down here, and I'm going to say nextSlideActive equals our button, okay? And so we'll do the exact same thing for our previous button, and we don't have to change any of the code. We just change the position and the text. So I'm going to copy this whole line. And so now we have prev slide active. And so we change this to prev, and then I can just move this other button either up or down, whichever you think looks better. If I move it to the to the left. That looks okay. Something like that. Doesn't look perfect, but it looks decent. You know, we can play with the styling to make it look a little bit better, but I think that looks good enough for now. And so now one button will tell us if the next slide is active, and the other button will tell us if the previous slide is active, but all the rest of this logic is the same. So you can see how we can encapsulate the idea of a button into one function, but we can use it to do two different things, or you know, however many things we want to do. So now we need to connect this to our event. So we need to know when the mouse is pressed. So we can use our mouse pressed function for this. We can say function mouse pressed. And now we can check if the next slide is active, we'll go to the next slide. If the previous slide button is active, we'll go to the previous slide. So we're going to check if next slide active. We're going to take our current slide value and we're just going to add 1. So we'll say current slide plus equals 1. Where? Ah, thank you. Okay, so now you can see we can go to the next slide when I click. And if I click somewhere else, nothing happens. So we get to our graphics, but then I can keep clicking. We can keep increasing the value. So we want to prevent the slide from going above our slide total. So we can add a condition here as well. We can say, and current slide is less than total slides. There's different ways to do this, but this is probably the simplest one. We're going to check to see if our next slide button is active, but we're also, so we're having two conditions. We're also going to make sure that our current slide is less than the number of total slides. If the current slide is the same as the number of total slides, then we don't have any more slides to view. So now we should get stuck at the end of graphics. And then we can basically do the same thing for our previous button. So we can say if prev slide active and our current slide, in this case, we want our current slide to be greater than 0, or sorry, greater than 1. Because 1 is our first slide. If we go to 0 or -1, we don't have a slide for that. So if our previous slide is active and our current slide is greater than 1, we'll say current slide, and we'll go in the other direction. We'll say minus equals 1. And remember, this is just a shorthand. This is the same thing as saying current slide equals current slide minus 1. So we're just taking whatever that value is, we're subtracting 1, and then we're reassigning it to that variable. Okay, so now our buttons should work. So we can go next, and we can go previous, but we can't go beyond. So we've created the least featured version of PowerPoint that is possible. But this is basically how PowerPoint works. You know, when you're creating software, you have to kind of start with the basics. Okay, so that's everything for our final project pitch template. There's a lot of different ways you could go about this. This is just one approach, but it's, you know, I think a simple approach that we can use. I'm gonna name this file final project pitch template, and I'll add this to our collection. So remember, you can just duplicate this. So if you go to File, go to Duplicate, you can just adjust the graphics, you can adjust the text, and make your own version of the pitch. Of course, if you want to, you know, program it on your own, that's a good way to learn how this all fits together. Let me see if I missed anything. I think that's it. Let's just put a note here that says return button state to main program, so we remember why that's there. Okay. Any questions on this code or the final project in general? Yeah.
Slice them.
Okay. Oh, you just forgot to return, so we need to return so we need to return that value to get it back out of the any other questions?
When is it due to?
So yeah, let's talk about the schedule again. I'm just gonna stop the recording, but